Hey everybody, welcome to week number 2 of our Comenius Learning Series online study this year called A Wounded Faith, Zinzendorf's Theology and the 21st Century. Again, my name is Chaz, and this is going to be another set of 3 videos where we're going to talk a little bit more and build off of what we talked about last week in last week's video and discussion, and also sort of build on top of that for our discussion this coming week on Zoom. So to give you a little bit of a recap, we started off talking about sort of what's the state of theology today and faith today. And we talked a little bit about how we're seeing these declines across theological perspective of faith communities. And we then began to look at Zinzendorf's theology. We looked at what made him radical in his day, his response to the Enlightenment, and his some of the issues of the Enlightenment that the Enlightenment raised, and how Zinzendorf approached reason and faith. And then we also went into then dove into the wounds theology and talked about Zinzendorf's theology of the wounds, how it was this deep connection to the incarnation of Jesus. It was this deep connection to the person, these wounds of Jesus that are not just the wounds inflicted on him at the moment of crucifixion, but the wounds of existence, the wounds of the incarnation itself. And that's kind of where we left our discussion last week. So this week, what we're going to talk about is this talk is entitled "Can the Wounds Heal? De-emphasizing Wounds Theology post-Zinzendorf." And we're going to really look at there's two things that this is sort of our transition point in this conversation, where we're going to move from talking about Zinzendorf and his time, and then shift into how can we carry sort of Zinzendorf's ideas along with us into the future. And so the first thing to really look at is what happened to Zinzendorf's theology after Zinzendorf passed away. Because as we sort of talked about last week, we have remnants of this wounds theology, some of this language and this imagery. We showed some references from our hymns, we showed references from our liturgies, but for the most part, this deep worship, liturgical, theological, communal emphasis on the wounds, and that's something that we're going to get to in these 3 sections of videos as well, is what does it really mean today in 2020 to build a community around the wounds, not just talk about them. And so that's going to be a really important thing that we begin to sort of move and talk about. And so the question that we're going to start with today is what happened to the wounds? What happened to this thing that was so important? And I wanted to share with you just just something to recap us, to get us thinking about this wounds theology again. This comes from Craig Atwood's book, Community of the Cross, which we referenced a little bit last week. This is from the introduction, the very end of the introduction. And I thought this was a good way to get us sort of primed and ready thinking about wounds theology again. So this is Craig, and he says, Zinzendorf painted the Savior before their eyes as they worshipped, worked, and slept. He offered the Moravians a God who shared their struggles and bore on his own body the strains and contradictions of their communal life so that they could live in harmony. And I really love that second part of that last sentence. That he offered that Zinzendorf's wounds theology offered the Moravians a God who shared their struggles, bore on his own body the strains and the contradictions of their communal life so that they could live in harmony. And I think that idea of what does it mean for Christ's wounds to bear the contradictions of our community, I think is something that is really really potent for us to talk about, because I think we can point at contradictions in our community. We can point at conflicts and contradictions, and thinking through how a wounded Savior can allow us to sort of to walk with that, I think is really important. So that's I think that just really summarizes sort of what Zinzendorf offered in his theology and the way that he understood the cross and Jesus, how he shaped the community, the early community of Moravians. So, what happened after Zinzendorf died? And so, as if for those who are familiar with Moravian history, sort of after Zinzendorf died, there a lot of these. A lot of the emphasis on the wounds theology, the wounds litany, they became less important after his. They became less used and less influential after Zinzendorf's death. And there are some historians who credit this to what is often called the sifting times in our Moravian history, but some other scholarship really shows that it wasn't the wounds theology that really were trying to be sort of eradicated during the sifting times. That really post Zinzendorf, after he died, there was a movement to sort of step away from some of Zinzendorf's stranger way of, at least for that time, stranger way of saying things, stranger imagery and verbiage, which we talked a little bit about in our last session, about how that there was this very deep and vivid imagery that I think would have been very strange to obviously the people listening, very strange to us today still, but it's even in this weirdness and strangeness is I think where we get some of the most potentially the most resonant things with sort of I believe where we are in theology today. So it's sort of, for me, it's sort of diving into that strangeness and seeing how that strangeness can continue to speak to us today. And one of the ways that one of the evidences of this sort of movement away from wounds theology is in Augustus Gottlieb Spangenberg, which was Spangenberg came right after Zinzendorf, was Zinzendorf one of his second in command, sort of right there with him, and really sort of took over some leadership after Zinzendorf died. He wrote something called the De Fide Fratrum, which was a attempt to sort of codify or to bring together Moravian theology and thinking for those outside of the Moravian Church, because other Christian groups, other churches has maybe heard some of these odder bits of Moravian theology and were kind of wondering what they were. And so Spangenberg wrote basically a systematic account of Moravian theology that doesn't have an account of the wounds theology in the way that Zinzendorf wrote it. But even though there was this move away from it, still in that text, in A De Fide Fratrum, we see elements of this deep focus on the incarnation still. This idea that Christ and Him crucified remains our confession of faith. So even though it loses its radicality and loses its sharp edge, we can see that there was something still about Zinzendorf's emphasis on Christology, emphasis on Jesus, that still carried through. Now, I think for the most part, Moravians did sort of move away from that wounds theology in a way that doesn't allow it to have the same level of impact, because we do see that a lot of the intensity of Moravian missions, the intensity of Moravian communities, they had a peak, and then they began to we began to ride the waves of sort of Western American Christianity in general, and sort of adapt more to the norms of sort of North American Protestantism, and we retain some unique practices and elements of our unique theology, but that unique theology being the core of what shaped being a Moravian or being a Moravian Christian meant, had kind of diminished. So it was, what I would argue is that it is this movement away from Zinzendorf's more controversial thoughts that really began to change the Moravian message. That what was radical in what Zinzendorf was saying about the wounds theology was it offered a confidence in weakness. It offered this how to work through the contradictions of life, how to what to do with some of the incongruities in life, and the things that don't make sense, and really living into that. It didn't offer a triumphal assurance, but it offered this confidence in weakness. This was not just for Zinzendorf. This wasn't just a picture of Christ, but that this idea of a wounded Savior applied to who God was. This is the way that we come to know God. But it wasn't just this Christ, but also God who suffers and is wounded. And one of the things that you see is that this theme of a God who suffers it moves into 20. You see this arise in 21st century theology. And I wanted to sort of start us and give us, as we wrap up this video, give one example of where we see this in 21st century theology, and then really move into that more in depth in our next video. So I wanted to share with you a quote from a pretty important text in sort of looking at 20th century theology, and that's Jürgen Moltmann's Crucified God. And this is it's a hefty text, but has some really, really powerful things to say. And actually, Zinzendorf and the Moravians get a few shout outs throughout this book, interestingly enough, throughout some footnotes in different places, and he speaks of them very favorably. But I wanted to sort of show how this Zinzendorf theology really connects well to some of the themes that are being brought up by contemporary theologians. And so this is from Jürgen Moltmann's Crucified God. He says, "The image of the invisible God. The meaning of this is that this is God, and God is like this. God is no greater than he is in this humiliation. God is not more glorious than he is in this self-surrender. God is not more powerful than he is in his helplessness. God is not more divine than he is in this humanity." And this is really profound, because what Moltmann is arguing here is that the height of God is found in the weakness of Christ. And I think this does run counter to some thoughts of God as mighty conqueror, or that God is in this business of winning through domination and through coercion, but really that Moltmann is taking the radicality of the crucifixion and taking it to the heart, and that's why he titles his book "Crucified God," taking the crucifixion, the cross, not just from the person of Jesus, but all the way to the heart of God. And this is important for Zinzendorf, and I think this is important for how this is the connection point that I would argue between contemporary theology and how Moravian theology really resonates quite well with that. So we're going to go into that more of that into the next video, but thank you for tuning into this one, and look forward to seeing you in our Zoom discussion. Grace and peace, everybody.